The Dark Tower is a series of novels written by Maine resident Stephen King, a prolific writer who was once hailed as a masterful storyteller by the BBC. In the fifth installment of the series, Wolves of the Calla, a small Calla community of farmers reach out to a band of traveling gunslingers after finally deciding to stand up against the wolves, a marauding group of green-cloaked creatures that periodically steal the children of the Calla once every generation. The wolves take the children into a shadowy land known as Thunderclap before sending them back to the Calla ruined via train. Tion Jeffords, the farmer who initially convinces the farmers and community to stand up and fight the creatures, calls a meeting at the beginning of the novel to discuss the prospect of fighting the wolves. In justification of his want and will to fight, Tion speaks these words. "And what of us? What is this doing to us? Some might say nothing, that the wolves have always been a part of our life in Calla, Bryn, Sturgis, like the occasional cyclone or earthshake, yet that is not true. They've been coming for 6 generations at most, but the Calla's been here 1,000 years and more. Each time they come and take our children, they take a little more of our hearts and souls. I keep thinking of trees. You could strip the leaves of a strong tree and it will live, cut its bark with many names and it will grow its skin over them again. You could even take from the heartwood and it will live. But if you take of the heartwood again and again and again, there will come a time when even the strongest tree must die. I've seen it happen on my farm, and it's an ugly thing. They die from the inside out. And that's what the wolves are doing to this little village of ours."
Standardized tests. The fastest way to terrify any child with 5 letters outside of just whispering the word clown. It's currently testing season all over the country, and with that comes the usual flood of anxiety and school-produced videos designed to get kids in the mood.
The test of the morality of a society is what it does for its children. So says the German theologian and Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer. What would Dietrich Bonhoeffer think now? For that matter, what would Tion Jeffords think of us? For the past 2 decades, the United States of America has continuously pushed an agenda for sweeping education reform, with national legislation passed including the No Child Left Behind Act, NCLB of 2001, and the implementation of the Common Core State Standards Initiative, CCSS, in 46 states in the District of Columbia over the course of the last half-decade. The reform movement has brought an incessant amount of standardized testing along with it. Valerie Strauss for the Washington Post explaining that with the Common Core Standards testing, for example, it kills innovation. When it's the only game in town, it's the only game in town. The literary allusion to Stephen King's Wolves of the Calla and the adjoining comparison and subsequent symbolic nature of the piece used in this piece's introduction is an exact example of the creativity and free thought at risk of destruction and oblivion with the continued implementation of acts such as the NCLB and the continued push for standardized testing within the United States of America. In the Calla, the children are brought back to their families shattered, empty, husks. In the United States of America, children are labeled with $signs while fed a nonsensical curriculum of bubble and answer keys. Children are being ruined. It's the greatest injustice of the 21st century. Now, to understand this issue, one must look back at recent history. One can trace the push for standards within public school districts and the push for STEM, science, technology, engineering, math-related subjects in comparison to the arts, to the Soviet Union's launch of the first man-made satellite Sputnik in 1957. Now, within the past 2 decades, this standard mindset has been cemented into the United States through 2 specific examples of national legislation. To quote The Atlantic, roughly 3 in 10 Americans think the George W. Bush-era federal education law has actually worsened the quality of education, according to a 2012 Gallup poll. And the generalized outline of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, pushed forward by Bush Jr., the law ultimately requires math and reading standardized testing every year for students attending public education schools in grades 3 through 8 nationally, along with high schoolers additionally. Individual school federal funding is based off how well students perform on the standardized testing, with general test score benchmarks used by the federal government in determining which test scores are acceptable. Now the quote, "Testing became the centerpiece of education reform, and schools faced harsh sanctions if they didn't fulfill expectations. Teachers invested more time in test prep and less time in valuable instruction. Schools shut down or in poor communities. Achievement levels are still drastically, greatly uneven." The Common Core Standards were developed in 2009 and released in 2010, to quote Diane Ravitch, an education reformer. Within the matter of months, they had been endorsed by 45 states in the District of Columbia. At present, publishers are aligning their materials with the Common Core, technology companies are creating software and curriculum aligned with the Common Core, and 2 federally funded consortia have created online tests for the Common Core. Essentially, The Common Core Standards is an add-on to the Bush administration's NCLB and the Obama administration's newfangled Race to the Top initiative, a federal grant set up to spur competition between school districts at the state and local level. Now, these two examples of legislation create the basis for how governmental and outside corporate interests can control public education schools in the United States. It's called bribery. Now, moving on to Supreme Court cases, there are very few cases directly linked to standardized testing. Notably, most cases involving standards include those based on affirmative action and test scores being linked to college and higher education acceptances. Now, moving on to Anya Kamenetz, explaining in the Washington Post article published in January 2015 detailing opt-outs. All this may explain why courts have stayed away from the opt-out question. These cases are so politically fraught. Complaints have been brought up by the ACLU and state attorneys generals have weighed in, but no opt-out disputes have yet to be settled in court. The article elaborated, stating that many others believe that the testing issue will be fought and resolved politically, not in the courts.
New at 5, just in time for kids heading back to school, Governor Cuomo had some harsh words about the controversial Common Core curriculum. In a statement today, the governor called the rollout by the state education department, quote, deeply flawed. Cuomo went on to say he sympathizes with frustrated parents.
The question is not, do you agree on standards? The question is, in New York, has it been implemented, has it been rolled out with a program that works?
In his statement today, the governor promised to convene a group of lawmakers, parents, and teachers, he says, to come up with a recommendation for Common Core before his State of the State address in January.
Now, specifically in New York State, what are some key policies and legislative examples associated with standardized testing? To quote the New York Times, New York was one of the first states to introduce tests based on the new Common Core academic standards. This year, the third under the new benchmarks, just 31% of the state's students passed reading tests and 38% the math. Both results were slight improvements from last year, but far below the passing rates under the easier pre-2013 tests. With such a high test refusal rate, any comparisons from year to year may be now somewhat skewed. Now, current Governor Andrew Cuomo has certainly, for the better part of his 6 years serving New York, elected in 2010, avidly supported the implementation of Common Core standards, at least up until the last 4 months of 2015. New York State, one of the 19 states to win funding from the Race to the Top initiative, was one of the fastest to implement Common Core testing, and what many educators, parents, and students have marred as an irresponsible, sloppy transition. For proof of that anger, look to the opt-out movement seen throughout the United States, but particularly prevalent in New York. To quote the New York Times again, more than 200,000 3rd through 8th graders sat out New York's standardized tests this year, education officials said on Wednesday, and a sign of increasing resistance to testing as more states make them harder to pass. Or now, moving beyond data and numbers, look to the blog Perdido Street School. Labeled a blog about public education, politics, and schools, Perdido is run by blogger reality-based educator who has taught in the New York City public school system for 15 years. Perdido commonly and colorfully displays posts such as this in regards to barbed comments from Cuomo directed at New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio this past December. Apparently, there's not one day where Cuomo or the flying attack monkeys who do his evil bidding aren't looking to stick in the proverbial knife. Reality-based educator 2015. The post heading was Cuomo's an ass even during Christmas. So despite Cuomo's latest charge over fixing mistake made in the Common Core's implementation within New York and his creation of a task force to recommend proceedings on the standards, many are skeptical of just how far the governor will go to implement real and substantial change. This anger seen in New York is not exclusive. It stretches across the entire country. Even here, in the Hancock Central School District in upstate New York, Delaware County, far outside the Long Island ground zero for opt-out, kids in the middle school and high school have chosen to skip standardized testing. During a Board of Education meeting in August 2015, District Superintendent Terrence Doherty explained that in the Hancock Central School District in 2013, the opt-out percentage for standardized testing was 3% in grades 3 through 8. In 2014, the percentage jumped into the 5% to 50% range, and in 2015, the opt-out percentage for Hancock was pinpointed to be exactly 52%. Parents within the United States have become increasingly disillusioned over the past year with incessant standardized testing, and it's becoming all too noticeable with opt-out percentages. Even Cuomo's hasty retreat this past fall signals a shifting trend and sentiment. The new education bill, the Every Child Achieves Act, as well, signed into law on December 10, 2015, points to a changing public view on standardized testing. The law severely severs federal power over universal state mandates, while also cutting federal power to hold money over floundering school system and incentive funds, pushing for the implementation of standards. So now why? Why is standardized testing wrong? Why is it detrimental to the United States of America? Why, much like the wolves of the Calla, are laws and legislation such as the NCLB and the Common Core State Standards Initiative turning children into husks? How is this killing the heartwood of America?
I think that if people like the Common Core standards, they should use them. But I think what's wrong is to say that you're going to just assume that kids will do better just because they've taken these standards. The poor kids are still not doing well. The kids with disabilities are not doing well. You have seen, I know Kentucky saw a dramatic decline in test scores. New York State saw a dramatic decline. My own feeling is that what Common Core is mostly about is that it's going to bankrupt the country. It's going to bankrupt education because all the tests, there are 2 tests that have been funded by the federal government to the tune of $350 million, which I believe, by the way, is illegal because the federal government is not allowed by law to affect either curriculum or instruction. Yeah. And when you say that the tests have no impact on curriculum or instruction, it's like, that's not true. I mean, the curriculum and instruction are driven by the tests. So we have federally funded tests that must be taken online. That means that every school and district in this country must buy hardware, software, and bandwidth, and billions of dollars will be spent. That's why there is such corporate support for the Common Core. First of all, because a lot of corporations are saying, we'll have our kids globally competitive. Well, you can't be globally competitive with countries that pay people $10 a day. I'm sorry, that will never happen. I mean, it would be a terrible thing for our society to think that we can be globally competitive with these low-wage countries. But there are also corporations that see enormous money-making opportunities, and billions of dollars will be taken out of school budgets to pay for hardware, software, and bandwidth.
Well, I was going to say software and the hardware, tablets. Does every kid need an iPad?
Well, Los Angeles just committed to spend $1 billion on iPads, and they'll be obsolete within 3 to 4 years, and so they'll have to do it all over again. They also committed to spend close to $100 million on the Pearson content that will be loaded onto
Pearson,
the iPad.
the company that's developing and is the lead developer of the testing service.
So there are school districts across the country that will cut the arts, eliminate programs, eliminate services, eliminate social workers, and close libraries so that they can be prepared for the Common Core testing. I think that doesn't make any sense.
Aside from the obvious downsides of taking emphasis away from individual thinking, free thought, moving against creativity, and instead bolstering a uniformed, homogeneous, perfect student that can be transferable to any cultural, socioeconomic, or geographical location in the United States, what are the downsides to standardized testing? To quote the Washington Post, the U.S. Department of Education is legally prohibited from exercising any influence or control over curriculum or instruction in the schools, so it cannot contribute any funding to the expensive task of creating national standards. The Gates Foundation stepped in and assumed that responsibility. It gave millions to the National Governors Association, to the Council of Chief School Officers to Achieve, and to Student Achievement Partners. After this, Gates gave millions more to almost every think tank and education advocacy group in Washington to evaluate standards. In 2008, Gene Wilhoit and David Coleman met with one of the richest men in the world at his headquarters in Seattle, Washington. Bill and Melinda Gates. Wilhoit was at the time the executive director for the Council of Chief State School Officers. Coleman, on the other hand, was a rising advocate for national standards. The 2 men persuaded the Gates to donate millions into the advocacy and movement for the Common Core. Turning again to the Washington Post, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation didn't just bankroll the development of what became known as the Common Core state standards. With more than $200 million, the foundation also built political support across the country, persuading state governments to make systematic and costly changes. When the word corporation is tossed so loosely about, it becomes generalized, and generalization is counterproductive. The Bill Gates example is perhaps one of the most widely publicized of private overreach into the public education system, and it provides a specific example far more tangible in comparison to a nameless corporation heartlessly ripping apart public schools. Money talks. Money also blinds. The NCLB, when coupled with the Common Core State Standards Initiative, directly ties teacher evaluations to standardized test scores. It also ties school system ratings and overall classification to test scores. The system broached by Wilhoit and Coleman and then bankrolled by Gates is a system set up for purposeful stagnation. The end goal is not a successful reform within public education systems, but instead to demonize teachers, unions, and public schools. It's a push for privatization. The end goal is to make money. With little governmental oversight in the private school sector, with no union protecting teachers, there is money to be made. Now, to quote Gary Sasso, reporting for Salon Magazine, posted on the Die and Ravage blog, After all, the wealthy did not achieve their wealth through an indifference to achieving a return on their investments. And our public school system is a $621 billion per year endeavor. For example, a recent investigation by the Arizona Republic found that the state's charter schools purchased a variety of goods and services from the companies of its own board members or administrators. In fact, the paper found at least 17 such contracts or arrangements, totaling more than $70 million over 5 years.
Not only is the gap between the rich and the poor growing wider, but we have a situation now in the United States where the richest 0.5% of the population owns 45% of the wealth. Okay? That means the richest 1% owns more than half of the entire wealth of this country, and the other 99% of us share the other half. Okay? And that gap, of course, under Reagan has grown. The rich are richer and the poor are poorer. Second of all, there was an interesting story that appeared in the papers a few months ago, and it talked about the fact that while we have now several million people sleeping out on the streets, while the average standard of living for the average American worker has declined during the last decade, what we now have in this country, and the good news is, I suppose for some people, is we have a doubling of billionaires. So all of you who are billionaires out there are doing very well. We went from 22 billionaires, not millionaires, billionaires, to 41. So at the same time we've seen a doubling, or almost a doubling, of billionaires, we now have people sleeping out on the street. We have millions of minimum wage jobs being created which people can't live on. The woman seems, I'm delighted to hear that that woman's family is doing very well, and obviously there are many other people who are doing well. But I think for the average American worker, when you look at wage increases compared to inflation, when you look at the cost of telephone bills and electric bills and housing and health care and higher education, the average American worker is in worse shape. And the disparity between the rich and the poor is growing worse.
And now, 28 years later, after this footage was shot, the issues Mr. Sanders describes are still prevalent in the United States today. To quote Sasso once again, can it be a coincidence that those who have benefited most from the last 50 years of steadily increasing income inequality, the top 10%, support an education solution that hinges on denigrating public school teachers, dismantling unions, and denying that income inequality is the underlying condition at the root of the problem? These are the reasons why standardized testing is so wrong. These are the reasons that make the implementation of such laws as the NCLB and the Common Core State Standards Initiative the greatest injustice of the 21st century. It's criminal, the use of children for petty, misbegotten greed. So, the all-important question, what can the people, the children, the students of the United States do about it? What did Mahatma Gandhi say so beautifully? Nobody can hurt me without my permission. The students of this country can do several things. Most important of all, the most important is to educate oneself on these issues, yes, bearing in mind politicians that fight against corruption and side with true education reformers such as blogger and former U.S. Secretary of Education Diane Ravitch, learning more about educational history in the United States, keeping up with world affairs and current events, but also educating in the aspects of life that are unattainable and unfathomable to those blank, empty, yawning canvases of test bubbles. Creativity, passion, love. Draw a picture, even if you're a horrible drawer. Paint a picture, even if you cannot help but splash water all across your shirt while sitting down with your brush. Although, rest assured, for clarification, the girl on the last slide is certainly an artist and an excellent painter. Write a song and sing it softly to yourself or to others. Write a poem and breathe it tenderly into the heart of someone else. Guess a song, create science, share stories, ambitions, dreams, protest, stand firm against limitations, organize local, regional, national protests, share educational messages on social media platforms such as YouTube or even Twitter. Reach out to local organizations that fight for unions. Learn more about your own school district. Learn more about the people in your own school district, janitors, maintenance members, and fight alongside your teachers. So the question, what can the people of the United States, what can the children, what can the students do to fight this injustice? What can the people do to fight this? The answer is everything.